There's a specific kind of paralysis that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with waiting for information that's never going to arrive in time to matter. The weather forecast is ambiguous. The knee feels maybe fine, maybe not. The schedule might work out or might not. And standing at the door, faced with 3 or 4 unknowns at once, the easiest thing in the world is to simply wait a little longer for clarity that would make the decision obvious, rather than actually deciding anything at all. Extreme ownership calls the fixed decisiveness amid uncertainty, and the core of it is almost uncomfortably blunt. In real situations, complete information never arrives in time. Waiting for certainty before acting isn't caution. It's a decision in disguise, usually the decision to do nothing, made by default rather than on purpose. The people who function well under real pressure aren't the ones with better information. They're the ones willing to make the best call available with what's actually known, commit to it fully, and adjust as more information arrives, rather than freezing in the gap between not knowing and needing to act anyway. I want to spend this whole episode on that idea, because I think it's one of the most practically useful principles in this entire book, and also one that's easy to misunderstand as recklessness rather than what it actually is. There's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from deciding under real ambiguity, a nagging sense that the decision might turn out to be wrong once more information eventually does arrive. And it took me a long time to see that this discomfort itself, not the actual uncertainty, was the real thing I've been avoiding for years. Here's the pattern I fell into for longer than I'd like to admit, and I suspect a version of it is familiar to plenty of people listening to this. Faced with any real ambiguity, an uncertain weather forecast, a knee that felt neither clearly fine nor clearly injured, a schedule that might or might not hold together, my instinct was to delay the decision, checking the forecast one more time, testing the knee with one more cautious movement, waiting to see how the morning's other obligations shook out before committing to anything. Each individual delay felt reasonable. Stacked together, they consistently produced the same outcome. By the time enough information had accumulated to feel truly confident, the window to act on it had already closed, and the delay itself had become the decision, just one I'd never actually chosen on purpose. Waiting for certainty doesn't feel like avoidance from the inside. It feels like being careful, responsible, unwilling to commit until the picture is actually clear. Asterisk, asterisk, that framing held up for a long time. What it actually cost to cross enough mornings was a training history full of runs that simply never happened. Not because a clear decision was made against them, but because no decision ever got made at all before the window quietly closed on its own. It's worth naming what that discomfort actually is, because seeing it clearly is most of what breaks its hold. Deciding under real uncertainty means accepting in advance that the decision might turn out to be wrong once more information eventually arrives. That's a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with, a small, honest risk of being wrong, taken on purpose rather than avoided. Waiting doesn't remove that risk. It just delays the moment of accepting it, while quietly adding a second, usually larger cost on top, the cost of the missed window itself. The discomfort was never actually optional. The only real choice was ever between accepting it up front and deciding, or accepting a worse version of it later, once the delay had already done its damage. There's a specific morning worth naming, because it's where I finally saw the pattern clearly instead of just living inside it. The forecast that day showed a real chance of storms. Not certain. Not clearly safe either, somewhere in the ambiguous middle that's actually the most common kind of uncertainty, not the dramatic kind, just the ordinary kind that shows up most mornings in one form or another. I checked the forecast 3 separate times in 20 minutes, waiting for it to resolve into something clearer, and it never did, because forecasts in that ambiguous range don't resolve on their own timeline. They resolve on the weather's timeline, which by then would be too late to actually use. The information I was waiting for wasn't coming. The only real choice was between deciding anyway, with the uncertainty still intact, or letting the uncertainty itself make the decision through inaction. Asterisk, asterisk. That morning, I finally just decided, arbitrarily by the clock, but not arbitrarily in terms of reasoning. Out the door in 5 minutes, with a clear fallback if the sky actually turned, rather than 5 more minutes of checking an app that had nothing new to tell me. The run happened. The storms, as it turned out, arrived 2 hours later than the ambiguous forecast had suggested they might. But the outcome that day was almost beside the point. What mattered was noticing, for the first time clearly, how much of my hesitation had never actually been about gathering real information. It had been about avoiding the discomfort of deciding under conditions that weren't going to improve no matter how long I waited. What made that particular morning stick with me afterward wasn't the run itself, which was fairly unremarkable. It was noticing in the days that followed how many other decisions across the week had followed the exact same shape, an ambiguous middle ground getting checked and rechecked long after the checking had stopped producing anything new. Once I could see the pattern in one clear instance, it became almost impossible not to notice it everywhere else it had been quietly running the whole time. A short list from that same week, once I actually started looking, included a meal decision revisited 4 separate times before finally just picking something, and a gear question, whether jacket was warm enough, that had been quietly unresolved for nearly 2 weeks despite having no realistic way to resolve itself, except by actually wearing it outside and finding out. None of these were dramatic. All of them shared the identical structure. Available information that had already peaked, followed by continued waiting anyway, purely out of a reluctance to commit to an answer that couldn't be perfectly guaranteed in advance. I want to walk through a few different places this shows up because decisiveness amid uncertainty ends up applying to more than just weather calls at the door. The first and most literal version is exactly the kind of morning decision, weather, minor pain, an uncertain schedule, where the honest amount of available information simply isn't going to increase meaningfully no matter how long the decision gets delayed. The skill here is recognizing that specific condition, this uncertainty isn't going to resolve on its own before I need to act, and treating it as the signal to decide now, with whatever's actually known, rather than continuing to wait for a clarity that was never coming. A second version, slower moving but just as real, applies to bigger decisions about the whole project, whether to attempt a new distance, whether to change a long-standing routine, whether a persistent ache means stopping entirely, or just adjusting. These decisions often feel like they deserve more research, more waiting, more certainty before committing, precisely because the stakes feel higher. But the same underlying trap applies, just on a longer time scale. More research past a certain point stops producing better decisions and starts producing only the feeling of having decided carefully, while the actual decision keeps getting deferred. I've caught myself researching a training adjustment for weeks that, once I actually looked honestly at what new information each additional week of research was providing, had stopped teaching me anything new by around day 4. There's a specific example worth walking through, because the abstract version of this can stay vague without something concrete attached to it. A persistent, low-grade ache in one hip sat in exactly this kind of research loop for the better part of 6 weeks, reading articles, watching videos, comparing conflicting advice, without ever actually testing any single adjustment long enough to learn whether it helped. The information available by week 2 was, in hindsight, almost identical to the information available by week 6. What kept extending across those extra 4 weeks wasn't genuine new understanding. It was the same discomfort from the storm morning, just stretched out over a longer timeline, avoiding the moment of actually committing to one specific change and living with the uncertainty of whether it would work. Looking back, part of what made that 6-week stretch so easy to justify was that each individual day of additional research felt harmless on its own. Nobody decides on day 1 to spend 6 weeks failing to act. The delay accumulates one small, reasonable-seeming day at a time, which is exactly what makes it so difficult to catch from the inside. The eventual fix looked almost identical in shape to the doorstep decision from that stormy morning, just slower. A specific cutoff, one more week of reading, and then commit to the single most promising adjustment regardless of whether the research had produced full certainty. It hadn't, and it was never going to. The adjustment, once actually tried instead of endlessly researched, turned out to help within about 10 days, information that 6 weeks of research alone had never managed to produce, because some kinds of information only ever arrive through actually acting and observing the result, not through additional reading. A third version, and one I didn't expect going in, involves this channel itself. Deciding whether a given episode's idea is developed enough to actually film, whether an uncertain interpretation of a chapter is close enough to write to commit to on camera, carries its own version of this exact trap. Waiting for total certainty about every interpretation before recording anything would mean never recording at all, since genuine certainty about how an idea applies to a specific life is rarely available in advance. The discipline here has been making the best honest call available, saying clearly when something is uncertain rather than pretending otherwise, and being willing to revise a take in a later episode if a better understanding shows up, rather than delaying every episode until an impossible standard of certainty gets met first. This version connects back to the very first episode in a way worth naming directly. Extreme ownership doesn't require being right the first time. It requires owning the call once it's made and adjusting honestly if it turns out to need revision. Every episode in this series represents a specific interpretation, chosen under exactly the kind of uncertainty this chapter describes, about how a chapter written for combat leadership actually translates to a single runner in a forest. Waiting for perfect confidence in every interpretation before recording would have meant this series simply never existing. 12 episodes deep at this point, each one a decision made with the best understanding available at the time, not a final, unrevisable verdict. There's a boundary worth being precise about here, because decisiveness can tip into recklessness if it's misapplied. This chapter is not an argument for deciding quickly regardless of the actual stakes involved. A genuinely dangerous situation, real chest pain rather than ordinary fatigue. A storm that's clearly and immediately overhead rather than ambiguously forecast. Calls for caution, not speed for its own sake. The actual skill being described isn't moving fast in general. It's correctly identifying which kind of uncertainty you're facing, the kind that will genuinely resolve with a little more patience, and where waiting is the right call, versus the kind that isn't going anywhere no matter how long you wait, where the delay itself has become the real risk. It's worth being honest that this distinction isn't always obvious in the moment, and getting it wrong in either direction carries a real cost. Deciding too quickly on something that actually did deserve more caution is its own serious mistake, not a virtue borrowed from this chapter. The goal was never speed for its own sake. It was accuracy about which category a given uncertainty belongs to. There's a specific test worth having ready for telling those two situations apart. Ask honestly whether more time is actually likely to produce new, decision-relevant information, or whether it's just providing more time to feel the discomfort of an unresolved choice. A weather system that's still forming and will clarify significantly in the next 20 minutes is worth a genuine wait. An ambiguous forecast sitting in the same uncertain range it's been in for the last hour, with no indication it's about to resolve, is exactly the second kind, where more waiting produces nothing except a later start on the same eventual decision. I found it useful to ask a slightly sharper version of this same question, one specific enough to actually answer rather than just reflect on vaguely. What exactly would change about my decision if I had the additional information I'm currently waiting for? If the honest answer is nothing, if the decision would come out the same either way, that's a clear sign the waiting was never really about information at all. just about postponing the discomfort of choosing under conditions that already contained everything needed to choose. If the honest answer is that a specific piece of information really would change the call, that's the signal a genuine wait is worth it, at least until that specific piece either arrives or the deadline runs out. So here's what this looks like as a practice, kept to one thing rather than scattered across several, the same as every episode in this series. The next time you notice yourself checking the same piece of information repeatedly, a forecast, a body signal, a schedule that keeps not resolving, stop and ask the specific question directly. Is this genuinely likely to become clearer soon? Or has it already told me everything it's going to tell me? If it's the second, that's the signal to decide now, with whatever's actually known, rather than continuing to wait. Make the call, state it plainly, even if only to yourself, and commit to it fully enough to actually execute, rather than continuing to second-guess a decision you've technically already made but haven't yet admitted to. I want to be specific about what committing fully actually looks like once the decision is made, because the moment of deciding isn't actually where most people fail this practice. It's in the 10 minutes afterward, still running through the same uncertainty mentally even after the door's already been walked through, quietly undermining a decision that's technically already been executed. A decision made under uncertainty and then relitigated the entire time it's being carried out gets almost none of the benefit that actually committing to it would provide. The discipline isn't just making the call, it's actually letting the call be made, setting the uncertainty down once the decision's been reached, rather than carrying it along for the rest of the run as unfinished business. That relitigating habit turned out to be its own subtle drain, worth naming separately. A run undertaken after a genuinely decisive call tends to feel lighter almost immediately, because the mental energy that would have gone into continued second-guessing is suddenly available for the actual effort instead. A run undertaken after a technically made but still being argued with decision carries that unresolved argument the whole way. I'll add one specific habit that's made this concrete rather than abstract. Giving uncertain decisions an explicit deadline in advance rather than an open-ended window to keep gathering information. Before checking a forecast or testing a questionable me, I now set a specific cutoff. 5 more minutes, 1 more check, and then the decision gets made regardless of whether the picture is actually clarified. That single constraint has done more to break the pattern of endless, low-value waiting than any amount of willpower applied after the fact, because it turns an open-ended, comfortable delay into a bounded one with a real endpoint attached. There's a second habit worth pairing with the first, useful specifically for the slower, bigger decisions rather than the morning ones. Before starting any research process, name in advance roughly how much time the decision actually deserves. A few days for a minor adjustment, a couple of weeks for something more significant, rather than leaving the research period open-ended by default. Research with a stated endpoint tends to stay focused on what's actually decision relevant. Research with no endpoint tends to expand to fill whatever time is available, regardless of whether that extra time is producing anything genuinely new. Both habits, the 5-minute cutoff for morning decisions and the stated research window for bigger ones, share the same underlying mechanism, converting an open-ended, comfortable delay into a bounded one with a real, pre-decided endpoint. That single structural change has done more for actually deciding on schedule than any amount of willpower summoned in the moment. Tomorrow morning, whatever's genuinely uncertain, whether a body signal, a schedule that hasn't quite resolved, is very likely to still be uncertain in 20 minutes too, no matter how many times it gets checked in the meantime. The decision that actually needs making isn't waiting on better information. It's waiting on you, deciding to decide with whatever's honestly available right now. There's a thread connecting this chapter back to nearly everything covered so far in this series, worth naming before closing out. Ownership asked you to stop outsourcing responsibility to circumstances. Prioritize and execute asked you to choose one problem under real pressure rather than trying to solve everything at once. Decentralized command asks the tired, executing version of you to have real authority to act without waiting for permission that wouldn't arrive in time. Decisiveness amid uncertainty is really the same underlying discipline applied to the moment right before any of those other ideas can even begin. The willingness to actually choose under incomplete information rather than waiting indefinitely for a certainty that was never going to arrive in time to matter. Every other idea in this book assumes a decision has already been made. This one is about the harder, quieter skill of actually making it on schedule with the information you've genuinely got. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.